talk about demand in this market. And I think we'll do a small exercise to establish what demand looks like in this market. So demand for carbon credits in the voluntary carbon market predominantly comes from corporate buyers. Corporations that have made some kind of decarbonization and sustainability pledge. Often it's a net zero commitment run through SBTi, which is why I'm looking at Scarlett. And as part of that, they are purchasing carbon credits. Now, for starters, Mark, I've heard you say this. How many corporations approximately are there in the world?
About 12 million. 12
million, approximately, corporations in the world. Scarlett, approximately how many have made net zero commitments under SBTi?
6,000?
6,000. So for starters, there's 6,000 corporations, many of them large multinational corporations that represent the bulk of emissions. But they are basically governed by SBTi in how they make their decarbonization plan. It's called a net zero commitment when it's done through SBTi. But then again, if we do the math, not my strong suit, but we can take 6,000 out of 12 million, and there's a whole long tail of companies and corporations around the world that also need to decarbonize. And so the voluntary market, we're going to talk today probably predominantly about how carbon credits and the carbon markets fit within the SBTi framework. But additionally, we should think about how we can galvanize and continue to encourage corporates to buy, even if they haven't made a net zero SBTi commitment. And so I think we'll start with introductions of our esteemed panel. I cannot imagine, really, frankly, a better panel to talk about this topic. We have, I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves, but I'll give the highlights because people often don't do themselves justice when they introduce themselves. So we have Mark Kenber, who holds very senior positions on the VCMI, the ICVCM, and as a board member of Verra. And the VCMI is, Mark will tell us more about it, but is a framework that is creating standards for how corporations can report on their use of carbon credits. We have Scarlett, who represents SBTi, which again is the framework by which corporations are making net zero commitments, and therefore it contains all of the guidance related to how those 6,000 major corporations can use carbon credits, both removals and avoidance, which is an important distinction as we will get into. And then Alexia is everything. She is one of the foremost policy experts in the carbon markets. She was recently the head of net zero at Netflix, so she has the sort of corporate buyer experience, which is super relevant to this discussion. She has senior roles on the ICVCM and the VCMI, and does many other things that she can talk about. And so for starters, please fill in what I left off of your bios. We could start with you, Alexia.
Great. Well, good afternoon, morning. I don't even know what time of day it is. It's really nice to be here. Dana, thank you so much for pulling together this conference. The most exciting thing that I see is a whole bunch of faces I don't recognize. And for someone who's been going to carbon market conferences for the better part of 18 years, it's really, really, really wonderful to see so many new faces in the room and to have so much energy and excitement around these key issues. So very quickly, I'm Alexia Kelly. I'm the Managing Director of the Carbon Policy and Markets Initiative. It is a new initiative that was recently launched just actually in February at the High Tide Foundation, which is a private family office focused exclusively on climate change, mostly through our philanthropy. So pleasure to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Hi everyone, I'm Scarlett from the Science Based Targets Initiative, and I'm leading the Beyond Value Chain mitigation work within SBTi. I can explain a bit more about that later, but essentially it's around companies going beyond their net zero or even near-term science-based targets to contribute additional climate finance on top. So yeah, very happy to provide more of an overview in a moment.
And thank you for the invitation. I'm Mark Kenber, and as Dana said, I'm the Executive Director of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, aka VCMI, and we work a whole range of issues on carbon, mainly voluntary carbon markets, but our main focus is providing guidance to companies in terms of two questions. When and under what circumstances can they credibly make use of carbon credits as part of their climate strategies? And secondly, what can they credibly say about it? And that second part is important because, as you all know, there is a plethora of claims ranging from things that sound fairly sensible like carbon neutral to climate super duper hero, which may not sound sensible, but there's bound to be a company who's called themselves there somewhere, and they don't mean very much. And sometimes they mean one thing, sometimes they mean something else, to provide credibility to the claims so that the public understand them and they're comparable.
Great. Scarlett, can you tell us a bit more about SBTi and particularly how it views currently carbon credits and what some open questions are about their use?
Sure. So the Science Based Targets Initiative was established in 2015 around the Paris Agreement. And the primary goal of the SBTi is to provide and promote best practice in terms of corporate climate target setting. So the kind of core of our business is around providing methodologies for all sectors and also sector-specific methods to decarbonize their own value chains in line with the 1.5-degree global goal. And we have both methodologies for the near term, but we also have the Net Zero Standard, which was published at the end of 2021. And the Net Zero Standard comprises 4 elements. So the first is the near-term targets that I mentioned before. The second is the long-term targets, up to 2050. We then require that at the end, once companies have delivered those long-term targets, that they then neutralize the climate impact of those residual emissions. And we define residual emissions as those which we believe, and scientists and many experts have sort of dictated, are the ones that are really too costly or too infeasible to abate at 2050. The fourth element of the Net Zero Standard, which is what I'm working on, is this concept of beyond value chain mitigation. So yes, we have 6,000 companies that have committed to the SBTi, either to net zero or to near-term targets. And those companies represent around a third of the world's in terms of market cap. So they are, many of them, very large companies. But there's 2/3 that haven't set targets. And we know that we have kind of, ineffective policy in some situations. So we have a huge kind of climate mitigation and finance gap. And so the concept of beyond value chain mitigation is really to encourage and provide guidance for companies that can and are willing to go above and beyond their own decarbonization to contribute additional climate finance. So we often frame it as around kind of a contribution to the global net zero goal, channeling finance to where there is a lack of finance, where existing markets are not already incentivizing flows of capital. So yeah, that's what we're doing, and we're developing guidance at the moment on BVCM. So what does best practice look like? Answering questions like, how much BVCM, what counts, what activities, what investments, what types of mechanisms, and also providing guidance on where are the best places for companies to actually direct that finance to achieve the climate impact that we need to see.
Thank you. And so the work of the SBTi has been incredibly rigorous and incredibly beneficial in that it has gotten 6,000 corporations to make clear commitments. It has elaborated what those commitments are, and corporations are now tracked on their paths to net zero, and that's very helpful. Alexia, I would love if you could talk about something that remains a little bit ambiguous or unclear within SBTi's framework, which is how can carbon credits be used? And with that, there is a distinction drawn between carbon removal credits and when they can be used, and carbon avoidance credits and if they can be used by a corporation at all. And so it would be good to tease out the distinction and then talk about why there are some concerns about that distinction being drawn and about how SBTi might treat carbon credits in general.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. And I can come at this a little bit from the perspective of having designed and implemented a science-based target that was validated by SBTi in my previous role at Netflix, where I oversaw our science-based target design and implementation work, as well as our carbon credit portfolio. And when we designed our program, the Net Zero Plus Nature program, we looked around and said, what is the most ambitious climate commitment we as a company can make? And what that looked like was a science-based target, so 46% reduction below 2019 by 2030, which is very ambitious across scopes 1 and 2, and then fully compensating for the residual emissions. And I think SBTi has a definition of residual emissions. The way we thought about residual emissions were the emissions that were left over when we had delivered our sort of SBT progress emission reductions on an annual basis, everything else. And it was a lot, right? So you can be on track for your science-based target and still be emitting enormous amounts of carbon. Most companies will. You have that long, slow decline, but for fast-growing companies in particular, our emissions were going to continue to rise before they really started to decline to meet our 2030 target. And so that meant that we emitted about 1.5 million tons a year. We needed to deliver somewhere on the order of 5,000 tons a year to be on track for our science-based target, which meant that we had 1.495 million tons a year that were still unabated and unaddressed in any way on an annual basis. And so we chose a kind of yes and formulation for the way in which we designed our target. The SBTi net zero guidance had not come out yet, and I think that there is still a lot of general uncertainty around kind of what the end winning framework is going to be for how we define and track progress towards net zero, because the current definitions of net zero in the market, while scientifically aligned, don't align with internal business making processes. So a 2050 target for my executive team at Netflix was completely irrelevant. Like, it just was like 2 decades longer than they ever thought about. Like, we really struggled to get them to think about a 2030 timeline. And so this balance of really sending that long-term deep decarbonization signal to the economy and corporations that we know is so important and so necessary. I am not negating the importance of this significant work we have to do between now and 2050. And the near-term signal to act is going to be incredibly important as we start to formulate what right looks like over the course of the next 24 months, because we really are in a formative moment in the carbon markets and in the corporate climate action space more broadly, as well as the greenhouse gas accounting and disclosure space. So all of those rules are, despite having more than 2 decades of work gone into them, really being rewritten today for the first time. And so my hope as we're going through this process over the course of the next 2 years or so, 2 to 3 years, is that we are able to very quickly align on not what the perfect looks like, but what right looks like now, and get companies moving and investing not just in the important deep decarbonization work that needs to happen within value chains, but also in the enormous numbers of mitigation opportunities that we know are out there around the globe, particularly located in the global south. And I think that's a big part of what VCMI is doing in the market. So maybe I'll pause there and would love to hear Mark's views on this question as well.
I similarly would love to hear Mark's views on this question as well. So very few people have spent as much time thinking about and architecting how corporations should think about decarbonizing and the use of carbon credits as you have. So would love to hear your views.
So, I mean, I think the work we try to do, providing a code of practice for companies, tries to, I wouldn't say bridge the gap, because I think on most things we're broadly aligned, but is to try and provide clarity and also recognize that while obviously we need to get to close to zero emissions or net zero by 2050, we can't leave other things undone between now and then. And a good phrase that people are using a lot is there's the risk of stranded opportunities. There are lots of opportunities to protect forests, to switch from dirty fuels to clean fuels, to have more efficient brick making practices or artisan manufacturing that don't happen now because there's no money for them. And I suspect all of us think, well, maybe the government should pay for that and there should be regulations, but if our government said, would we pay an extra 2 pence of income tax to pay for all that, we go, yeah, not today. So we're not getting the money to finance these things, and many of these opportunities will disappear if we don't take them now. We can't say, oh, we'll stop the deforestation in 15 years' time, because there may not be any forests left. And the 15 years' time where we could switch a whole region from dirty fuels to clean energy, if they've just invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in diesel gen sets, then it'll be too late. So it's how do we not lose some really important, in often cases quite simple, and relatively low cost opportunities to cut and remove emissions now. And so the question we try to answer and work with others on is, so how do we not waste that opportunity while at the same time being true to what the science tells us we need to do, making sure those corporates, and I think one point, you can tell me if I'm wrong, Scarlett, but 6,000 companies with scope 1, 2, and 3 footprints of over 30 billion tons a year, if I'm not mistaken. So that's about, 55, 60% of global emissions. So we want to keep those companies working, but we also recognize that the journey for every single company will be different. And that's why in the guidance we've been developing, and we will be publishing on November the 28th. I shouldn't say things like that in public, because when I have to postpone it, it'll be embarrassing, but I've said it now. When we publish the next round of our guidance, one of the things we'll be looking at, and we're exploring at the moment, is to what extent is it credible for companies as part of their decarbonization journey to use carbon credits for some part of that. Now that doesn't fit with SBTi guidance at the moment, and we're not trying to in any way create a rift. Here's the difficult one, here's the easy one, take your pick. But rather, if we could make the case that by allowing some flexibility in the use of carbon credits, and therefore driving additional carbon finance so those opportunities don't be stranded, would that mean that we go from 6,000 to 10,000 companies? Would those companies set, instead of 46%, 51%? And so on and so forth. And that's research that we're conducting through survey work, through modeling. It will not tell us the answer is X, it never does, but it will help us decide, okay, is it worth trying this? And then collectively we'll review this. Okay, we thought that the evidence suggested that there should be additional use of carbon credits. 2 or 3 years' time, has that made a difference? And if it has, then okay, we'll carry on. And if it hasn't, then we'll say, okay, we tried. And I think it's quite important to emphasize the fact that in the wider world, in conferences like this, people often try to pit VCMI and the carbon markets people against SBTi and the target setting. Couldn't be further from the truth. We need rigorous science-driven action to address the climate crisis. I mean, we're all here in this room because it's a climate crisis, not a climate problem or a climate hobby on a Sunday afternoon. It's a crisis, so we need everything we can do. And so we need this science-based approach, but we also, I believe, need to get money flowing to where low-cost options to reduce and remove emissions, which also have incredible, and people talking about side benefits, real genuine impacts on people's livelihoods, their biodiversity, their income generation, gender equality, a whole bunch of things that carbon finance can help. So when you hear in the wider world the very polarized debate between the people who say carbon markets will solve all the world's ills, carbon markets are a pact with the devil, ignore them. As in everything in life, there's nuance here, how to do it well, and that's, I think, what all three of us are trying to do in our respective institutions.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the synopsis of the VCMI's work and of how we can move forward very productively. I think what's really interesting and important to focus on is what you talked about, the opportunity that's in front of us, which is there are an enormous array of high quality projects that have unbelievable benefits, both from a carbon standpoint and not to speak of additional co-benefits on top of that. You have capital, so you would fundamentally have the capital to finance these projects, but as we all know, because everybody works in the real world, you have to make this conducive to the way that corporations behave and decision make. And so what I have heard time and again in working with corporate buyers, which we do at Flowcarbon all the time in designing corporate solutions for corporations as part of their decarbonization strategies, where they're left is a moment where they are on track to meet their SBTi net zero commitments. And so they get the check, they get the gold star for being aligned with their net zero commitments. And then if the team wants to go ahead and purchase offsets, what they're now faced with is an unclear additional reporting or designation that they get commensurate with doing that, but they are exposed to all of the things that corporations are exposed to when they buy, which is, at the moment, showing up in a fun article in The Guardian or other such exposure that they have, on top of having to secure budget for something without a clear thing to point to. And so it's a sort of nebulous moment for corporate buyers, especially with regards to avoidance credits. And so Scarlett, I'd love to hear your views on how beyond value chain mitigation might solve it in some way, and how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe firstly to mention that beyond value chain mitigation is both emissions reductions, avoidance, and removals. So it is both, to be very clear. The neutralization at the end, once a company's achieved their long-term target, that is permanent removals only, and we are working to define what permanent means and what would count. So how will BVCM kind of solve this issue for companies? Well, we have done a bunch of research this year where we went out and spoke to a number of companies to understand what were the barriers that were preventing them from making these additional investments, and also to kind of ideate what potential new incentive mechanisms could really get them to unlock their capital. The biggest barriers were, well, the first was essentially a lack of a credible claim, which is great that VCMI is clearly working on that. So that's clearly an important one. Companies want to be able to codify and communicate what they're doing in a way that they know is not going to give them, risk of showing up in a Fund Guardian article. The other was around lack of investor pressure. So investors, I think, there's clearly a difference between offsetting in the traditional sense, where a company isn't doing anything, they don't have an internal carbon target, but they're buying cheap carbon credits instead. And I think we're all in agreement that that sort of approach is not science aligned. But it's sometimes a bit difficult to tell the difference between that and when a company is doing their internal work and buying carbon credits, contributing finance to mitigation elsewhere on top. And so I think having very clear guidance and kind of consensus among the NGO communities about what good looks like and how can we distinguish between the bad actors and the good actors. So I think the guidance that we're producing, I'm not so naive to think that a guidance document will suddenly unlock billions or trillions of dollars of capital, but I think what it will do is give confidence to those companies that already see the value in this, and maybe were already doing it in the past, that they're not going to be accused of greenwash because this is what we kind of agree best practice looks like. There's also clearly a need to really articulate what the business case is and really understand it, and that was something that we've been spending a lot of time trying to unpick. And I think it's very clear to me, at least, that the business case does differ across sectors. And also, really realistically, the capacity to pay also differs across sectors. Some sectors have a much higher abatement costs. We really need them to focus on bringing the cost curves down of hydrogen and green steel, et cetera. Otherwise, we as a society are not going to be able to achieve the long-term transition. Whereas other sectors have maybe higher margins, maybe they have much kind of closer tie to consumer brand value. And for those companies, clearly BVCM is really important. So I think trying to understand and articulate that sector-specific business case is really critical.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Alexia, any reflections on how BVCM fits into the sort of corporate psyche when it comes to decision-making around carbon credits?
Yeah, well, I think from a buyer's perspective and kind of the grand bargain that we've struck in a world in which we do not have effective regulatory regimes in place to actually solve this problem, right? Like, that's obviously the thing we really need. We're not going to solve climate change on the backs of voluntary markets, like, let's be clear. But they can make a really important near-term contribution, and they are actively starting to incentivize investment in really important technologies. And so one of the big things that's changed over the course of my career in this discourse is that we get to have both now. We get to have our science-based target that says, yep, companies, you're going to do the super hard work of decarbonizing your operations, because I will tell you, it is really hard and slow. We've been trying to get an 8 megawatt microgrid deployed on a studio. It's taken us 4 years just to get through the interconnection analysis process, right? Like, you don't just, there's a 2-year wait for heavy duty electric vehicles right now. And they don't even make them in the classes of vehicles that we need for our particular applications as a studio and a production company. And so, sorry, and I'm obviously not speaking for Netflix. I keep saying we, but don't work at Netflix anymore. But it was really, it really was, I was shocked at how hard it is to decarbonize a company that operates in the real economy, because it turns out fossil fuels still touch every single part of every single business's operations every single day. And it is diffuse across an enormous array of activities. We had operations in a whole bunch of countries. And so figuring out that decarbonization strategy, especially when you don't own anything, is not a straightforward exercise. And our marginal abatement cost internally of reductions was enormously variable, right? It was negative 500 to somewhere around $1,500 a ton. So we want companies to be doing that work. We need them to be pushing those supply chains to change. We need them to be being that off-taker, that's gonna do that first deal and pay that super high price. Not all companies, in fact, most companies are not going to be willing to do that. I also wanna be really clear about this, because most companies, if it doesn't at least break even, they're not gonna do it. And the things that companies can really make money on right now are unfortunately relatively limited. And so we have to be really, I think, just ruthlessly pragmatic when we talk about where the real economy is and where the science is and is telling us where we need to be, because they are not anywhere close to each other right now. And so buyers really need a simple thing. They just need to know, what do I get to say for the work that I'm doing? And that is what we have in the voluntary market. We have the claim. And so getting the claim right and getting the claim structured and the incentive structured in a way that really does get companies moving is the most important thing that we can collectively be doing right now. And so my hope is that we can work together to really clarify that policy signal and figure out the thing that we want to call it, because it honestly doesn't matter that much. It just needs to get all of the companies moving in the right direction so that we can get this transition really rolling. And the last quick thing I'll say is just that the carbon markets and the work that's been done in the carbon markets over the last 15 years, I will say unapologetically, is the most rigorous greenhouse gas accounting that's done anywhere in the world. Full stop. I've worked on national inventories, I've worked on corporate inventories, I've worked on the UN inventory system, and I can tell you with a high degree of assurance that the level of rigor that goes into these project-based methodologies is significantly higher. That does not mean they're perfect. This system is never gonna be perfect, it can't. Especially when you're looking at projecting a counterfactual baseline into the future, right? But that is an inevitable part of the transition and accounting for targets everywhere. It's not just at a project level. Projects just happen to go first. It's also, we're gonna face the same challenges at a company level, and we're gonna face the same challenges at a national level. So getting aligned on what right looks like for baseline projection methodologies and approaches, and then leveraging the incredible new technologies that are coming down the pike and that many of you are working on in this room, I think is some of the most exciting work, and it's gonna enable us to get that visibility and transparency that's so necessary so that investors can invest with confidence, companies can address their emissions with confidence, and we can get this entire system moving in the right direction.
Excellent, thank you.
I'd like
Mark.
to just pick up on that. I think what you've said is just so crucial, especially in this sort of febrile atmosphere we have where things are either perfect or they're a complete disaster. And we know in every aspect of our daily lives that nothing is really like that. When we criticize a carbon credit or a corporate baseline for not being perfect, I said this at dinner last night, it's like saying to my daughter when she was 5 years old, "You haven't got your PhD yet? Loser!" I mean, come on, she's only just started school. So the carbon market's not 5 years old, it's probably just leaving high school. And we don't expect it to be perfect, but we want continuous improvement. I mean, that's, you think about the education system, you learn more, you become more agile, more creative, more intelligent. That's what we need. And so I think we need to be reasonable about this. There are clearly boundaries. If there's rubbish out there, then let's get rid of it. And that's what a lot of the work on the standards is doing, both on the ICVCM side, VCMI side, but even the standalone standards like Verra, Gold Standard, others, they're always looking at continuous improvements. And that's the point. And Alexia makes the absolutely crucial point about new technologies. A lot of the digital MRV stuff, that wasn't available 10 years ago.
Totally.
So trying to judge something 10 years ago with the technology we have now doesn't make sense. But we should judge it now. So the methodologies need to improve, the monitoring techniques need to improve, the measurement needs to improve. But again, it's not going to be perfect, because in 10 years' time, be all sorts of things that we never thought of. I mean, who wrote all their Christmas cards using ChatGPT 5 years ago? all those kind of things. So things improve, and we need to move with that. And equally important to that is then that when we discuss this, we're thinking about what does good enough look like now, and good enough needs to be continually improving. So we're thinking, what is beyond reasonable doubt? You're a lawyer, so in a criminal trial, you've got to be convicted beyond reasonable doubt. So let's have that. What does beyond reasonable doubt mean? Probably balance of evidence is not quite good enough, but beyond reasonable doubt would be. And that's going to change over time. We get more evidence, then where that beyond reasonable doubt sits changes as well. But if we're only going to invest when we have perfection, there ain't going to be investment. Those opportunities will be stranded. And I just think it's a really important message for people to take away, because we are assailed on a daily basis by people saying every carbon credit in the market is junk, or this is going to save the planet, and neither of them are true. And we need to be sensible about it, we need to talk about it, we need to share experiences, we need to understand how technological and knowledge improvements will drive improvements in the market, will also drive improvements in how corporates set their baselines. More knowledge about how you can reduce emissions, where the least cost options are. And I think that goes to the point, in a way, both of you were making. This is a process, but it's a process we need to keep moving with now, not wait till it's perfect. And I think that's the message for both carbon markets, corporate target setting, how you account for this stuff. Don't expect perfection. Think about what's beyond reasonable doubt and keep pushing that forward.
Hear, hear. Couldn't agree more. I think that gets a round of applause. That was very well said. Where's my mic? The one thing that I'll add is, and I'm sure you meant this, needs improvement and is improving. It's all actively happening. We have the amazing work of the ICVCM on the quality side of the market. We have the incredible work of VCMI. We have the standards bodies doing incredible and important work to up-level everything about their operations, to incorporate in digital MRV technology, to digitize their methodologies, et cetera. So there's a tremendous amount of dynamic work happening as we speak every day.
But Dana, let's not fall into hubris either.
Okay.
There are problems. We've got to address those problems,
Yes.
and that's how we make things better. It's no more useful to us to say it's all rubbish than to say it's all perfect, because neither are true. And I just say that because I don't want people to go away that we're sort of starry-eyed evangelists who think everything's going to be perfect. We've got to be realistic. You've been in this, Alexia, for 18 years. I've been doing this for longer than I care to remember. Likewise, all of us have been working this a long time. We know things change. And if we deny the things that are bad, then we're kidding nobody but ourselves.
Agreed.
And that improvement is where we learn and how we make things better.
Absolutely true. I want to ask you all to, you all have deep institutional affiliations, both current and past. And I want to ask you to remove them for the moment and just think about if you had the ability to sort of wave a magic wand and conjure up an image of this market 5 years from now that is functioning as efficiently and as positively as you would like to see, what would that look like? Scarlett, we could start with you.
Well, I think I'm a bit impacted by some of the meetings I've been having this week, but I think for me, making sure that they are really delivering for the communities, which they're meant to be supporting, because I think, the carbon market has changed a lot over the last 20 years, but there were some atrocious things that were happening many years ago where we had kind of land rights being abused, etc. So for me, getting to a place where it really is delivering benefits to those communities, and that they're part and they're participating in the process, that for me would be a very, special target and aim.
Yeah, Alexia?
Yeah, I think for me, it is really a market that's operating, at a 10x scale from what it's operating at today, through a highly transparent and integrated set of infrastructure. I know I mentioned this before, but enormously excited about the opportunities for improvement that DMRV tools and technologies are offering the market generally. We're in a moment now where we're really trying to figure out how we integrate all of those technologies into the existing crediting and methodologies and those systems, and that the implications of remote sensing technology in particular for understanding what's happening on a real-time basis, informing baselines, really making sure that we have the permanence of the emission reduction benefits that we're issuing credits to is just astronomically important for this market. As Mark said, we didn't have any of that 10 years ago when these methodologies were first being developed. And you see with a lot of the older projects that like miscalibration on the baselines was because they were sort of pen and paper exercise based on data that was probably not as good as it needed to be. So like with any modeling exercise, you know, garbage in, garbage out. So this is going to enable us to really start squeezing those out so that that isn't happening on a regular basis, and enabling us to really give investors and buyers and standard setters the confidence that the emission reductions that we're saying have occurred have actually occurred. So that transition is also enormously exciting. Pricing transparency, transparency around benefit sharing arrangements and agreements with local communities, enormously important, and better and more sophisticated tools and techniques for addressing co-benefit quantification is also going to be enormously important. So water quality impact, as well as biodiversity and other essential ecosystem services that these credits projects currently deliver, but are not receiving any value for. So how do we really start to stack that full suite of impacts and benefits at a local level into the credit so that it can be monetized and exchanged in a transparent way?
Great. Mark?
So I would absolutely agree with the point about transparency. It's something that many of us have been arguing for a long time. I think we need to, if we're going to counteract a lot of the, not counteract, if we're going to respond to the very legitimate scrutiny and counteract quite a lot of the less legitimate attacks on the market, we only do that by being radically transparent. That every company, when it's reporting, is showing what credits it's using, for what purpose, how it's accounting for it, how it's different from, how it relates to internal decarbonisation, how it complements it, all the things that others have said about benefit sharing and so on and so forth. In 5 years' time, I think we will need to move towards a more sectoral or jurisdictional based approach. And we're seeing in the forest protection sector more and more emphasis on jurisdictional approaches where you're looking at the whole of a biome or the whole of a region, and you're looking at how projects, either programs across the whole of the region or projects nested within that region, are contributing to reducing deforestation or restoring forests within a region. I think that doesn't solve all the problems, but it avoids some of the problems like leakage that others have referred to. But I think we can see that applying to other sectors, not just in the land use sector. And an example I often get, many years ago I had the benefit of visiting Dar es Salaam, and I visited a number of people who make small artisan brick manufacturers. Low quality bricks using lousy fuels, lots of dust, not particularly cheap, very energy inefficient, lots of greenhouse gas emissions. If you wanted to go, and I think there were several hundred of these, if you wanted to deal with each of those as a project, you'd never get there because the startup cost, the validation cost, the project development cost, the project finance cost would be prohibitive. So at the moment that depends on development assistance. But if you could treat them as a sector, and it's not simple, and think about how do you generate improvements across the sector, drive new technology, and so on and so forth, capacity building, then you get far greater emissions reductions, you reduce some of the transactional costs. And I'm not pretending it's simple, but we need to look at those kind of things where several investors can invest in a reduction below a baseline across a whole sector. And I think then it's a way of spreading the risk. If you're dealing with individual brick manufacturers, one of them's going to fail, one of them will go bust, one of them won't do the job properly. But across the sector, you can measure it, you can and build that into the risk management system. Then I think you can drive far larger quantum of capital, greater emissions reductions, and have something that's probably easier to quantify and account. So I think that's where we need to go. It's not going to be all in one go, but we should push in that direction.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think does harken back to some of what David Antonioli was talking about, where we need to get a bit broader and look sectoral, and look at how we can transform some of the way that we do things in order to achieve scale. Since we have such an esteemed panel, I'd love to know if any of you have questions for one another.
Given that we seem to spend about 18 hours every day in each other's company.
I'd rather talk to you guys. We talk to each other all the time.
Yeah, so why don't they ask?
Yeah, so we can open it up to 2 questions from the audience. Yes? It's you. Yeah. Oh, just speak really loudly.
I'm looking for a microphone. Should
Yeah.
Do you want to lean into my chest?
So, Gabriel Walker, I'm co-founder of Puro Earth and Rethinking Removals, focused on the carbon removals more or less 20 what's kind of still worrying me about the whole the contribution approach, the VCM, here we go. What does good look like? All of that is this pressing issue that we actually have to build an entire carbon removals industry in very short shrift, and that carbon removals credits typically cost much more than any other kind of credit. So that if they're actually treated as equivalent until the point at some point in the future where you neutralize, when we get to that point in the future, there won't be enough carbon removals to actually be able to do the thing. So that's apparently at the moment an intractable problem. It's like, how do we start now with carbon removals? They're much more expensive without actually stopping the other credits. And my question is really, one question is it actually possible to think about having a science-based carbon removal target to go alongside a science-based carbon reduction target, more or less to guarantee that by the time we actually need the neutralization, it will actually be in place? Or what are other ways to address that issue of building the industry very, very dramatically quickly over the next 10 years, which is what the scientists tell us we need?
Scarlett?
Yeah, so we've just closed the public consultation on beyond value chain mitigation, which, as I mentioned before, is emissions reductions and removals. And we got a number of comments from players that are looking to scale the voluntary carbon market to that effect. So we are looking at that at the moment. We have always said with beyond value chain mitigation that it's about investing in nature as clearly a big priority right now, given we have tipping points and the forests are going to be gone soon. But we've also very clearly said it is about ensuring that the costs come down and that removals are available at scale in 2050. What we did in the public consultation document was, which, as I say, is we're still processing and we'll be finalizing the guidance soon, but we said that we think that companies need to be investing in a portfolio approach. So it's not avoided deforestation or carbon removals. It has to be both, because both are very important. And so, I think it would be unlikely that we would at this time dictate a certain percentage of reductions versus removals, but we want to really strongly emphasize that we see a role for both of them. The second part of your question was around what else would scale carbon removal market, and I think we've got some exciting things happening around not the SBTi, we as a community, around transition planning. For me, it is a very clear risk argument. If a company has committed to net zero, they know they're going to have a significant, well, it's still much less than today, but it's still a large number of residual emissions that they can't abate. If they're going to have to pay $500 a ton, or wherever that would be at the time, or today's costs, that is going to be an astronomical cost for them. So actually, investors need to be looking at companies and saying, what are you doing today to make sure that you don't have to bear those very large costs in the future? So I think it's, yes, the SBTi has a role, but also there's a role of others in the climate ecosystem, policymakers, transition task force, etc.
Great. We have time for one more question. There was a hand here, yeah. Hey.
Thanks, Dana. I have a question for Mark on the theme of improvement. Independent research shows that less than 10% of companies with an SBTi target can actually meet VCMI's claims code of practice for use of carbon credits. So my question for you is, what steps is VCMI going to take to ensure that that 6,000 number that's currently signed up for VCMI, for SBTi, that can actually go to 10,000 and not be limited to 600, which is what the state would be right now?
Yeah, okay. So I think maybe I wasn't very clear. In the claims code that we published the first part in June, which lays out 4 basic steps that companies need to follow to demonstrate that use of carbon credits complements rather than substitutes for internal decarbonisation action. We've all said here, we need both. We can't live without both. The claims that you're referring to were the ones we published in June, which are the ones that, use shorthand, you've met your science-based near-term target, and then you use carbon credits as pure beyond value chain mitigation. We're exploring, both through consulting with a range of businesses, with our colleagues in SBTi and elsewhere, doing independent research to say, if we relaxed the rules on meeting the target and said companies can use carbon credits in some time-limited or some limited fashion as part of their decarbonisation journey. So not as above and beyond value chain mitigation, but as part of it. If we could demonstrate clearly, there's enough evidence to suggest that would mean that exactly what you're asking for. More companies take on targets, more companies set more ambitious targets, more companies reduce more emissions more quickly. If we can make that case, then we will introduce those claims tiers, and because it would have exactly the effect I've just described. But if the effect, and I don't believe this would be the case, but if the effect is companies just buy a bunch of carbon credits, don't take any more action, and so they're just substituting one thing for another, then it would be very hard for me to justify it. I think the evidence will suggest the first case, but we need to be driven by that. And as I said before, we also need to try it out and then see what happens. If after 2 years, whatever the right time frame is, we are seeing more action, then we can say, okay, we did the right thing, maybe we need to tweak it here and there. But if it's not, then we need to hold our hands up and say, it's not working, what's the other approach? And a lot of these things, you know, I'm not afraid in the slightest. I am wary of the fact that if we do publish these additional claims, there will be a lot of criticism. But what I would say to the people who criticize is, hold on for a couple of years. If in 2 years it really hasn't worked and we're leading to more greenwashing, then I will be the first to hold my hands up and said, we didn't get it right. But let's judge it on the basis of evidence, not on supposition or ideology, one way or the other.
Yeah, and I think there was a great report that came out a few months ago, I think by Trove, which showed that the companies that are the ones that purchase the majority of carbon credits are by far the most advanced and committed in all of the other decarbonization work and in meeting their net zero pathways. So there is at least some evidence that I've seen to suggest that those who are the most committed on decarbonizing and doing the hard work that Alexia described are then the ones that are going out and on top of that purchasing carbon credits. And I think that this conversation is just about how to allow them to do that work in an established framework in a way where they can make a claim and secure internal buy-in for continuing to do that and for other corporations being able to do that. With that, we will close. This was a phenomenal discussion. Thank you.